Hi, thank you. So I guess a little bit more about my background. I am a trained educator and facilitator. I've run professional development workshops for teachers and artists who teach in the schools, in public schools in New York City. I also worked with students directly of all ages, from pre-K through high school. And I currently teach English as a second language, right now part-time at a local English language school. As far as engineering and data science, I am pretty much self-taught, although I feel a little strange saying self-taught because I really learned programming and architectures within the community in New York, and both the programming community, the startup community, and technology at large in New York City. So I'm very grateful to have had that opportunity. I actually took a hiatus from teaching in, I guess it was between 2004 and 2005. And for a while I worked at an integrated marketing agency. And I did that right up until the Great Recession hit, and of course at that time I still wanted to stay active and engaged. I was also becoming very interested in social media, so I continued to do that while things were pretty slow. And I became even more excited about the way that social media augmented what human beings could do. The way that they could connect with each other, the way that we could form and assert our identities, and just maintain connections. At one point, I did start to become concerned about the fact that, although at that point I was an adult, I had pretty good judgment about what I should and shouldn't post online, but with all the care that I took to maintain my privacy settings, I realized that I had absolutely no control over what the startups at that time were doing to protect my data. And so I became really interested in privacy and what kinds of processes we could put in place to make sure that people's privacy was being respected, the same way that they could kind of regulate what they were exposing to the outside world. Actually, I am happy to note that in the past 5 years, there's been a lot of attention. People have been paying a lot of attention to privacy and proper processes within their organizations, and even in government, to make sure that we were protecting each other online and creating safe spaces for people to interact, also protecting personal data, which means that I could concentrate on more of or on other things that were emerging, such as, I think when social media first came out, it was all about content. And we hadn't yet started analyzing that content or analyzing people's behaviors online. So that's actually something that brought me more into data science than privacy. But it all ends up connecting, so. Along those lines, I wanted to start exploring my personal data, and I thought that might mean putting it all into one place, which also made me nervous because I felt like I might just be creating a honeypot for hackers, and I didn't want to do that either. So I decided to create a project that I called My Little Data in a Big Data World, which I had the opportunity to kind of soft launch as a poster at PyData 2015. And it describes an early process of retrieving personal data, securing and exploring it, and identifying the tools that you can use to start cultivating your own identity, not just by writing, but by looking at yourself in your digital form. So I guess I assume that most people use social media, but how many of you actually do use social media? How many of you share information on social media? Okay, so most of you. And how many of you use email? Yeah, that's what I figure. Now, I'm guessing that a lot of you, or actually, does anybody analyze social media as part of your data science practice or engineering? Okay, some, a little bit. Okay, this is good. And what about, I think in general, we don't analyze email per se, but there are some anonymizing practices and machine learning that is used and where data science is applied to help people do things with email without necessarily having humans read it. So, I skipped a little bit. So, as data scientists, of course, you want to look at data and come up with the most objective analyses that you can. And sometimes part of your job is to find information that can be used in marketing. And I found this little tidbit on Twitter about what happens sometimes when we're using data in marketing, or how that ends up being used. Can everyone see it? Okay. Now, I have to say that for this project, My Little Data, I am interested in letting people know enough about how to access data tools and how to use their own data, so that maybe they don't quite do that, but they can use data to make decisions about maybe next steps in their lives. So, for example, you might analyze your LinkedIn data. You might look at your connections and the positions that they've had, where their work has overlapped with your work or what you might aspire to do. And that might give you some guidance about your next steps, especially as the economy changes pretty quickly. So, of course, the slide that you just saw talked about, or, showed you a little bit about data manipulation of findings and data. But, of course, if this happens in politics or school admissions or hiring decisions, if you're moving away from objectivity, then that can be a problem. And one thing that I thought might be important would be to make data more accessible and make data analysis more accessible, so that as people encounter decisions that are made by some of the tools that we create as engineers and data scientists, that people know enough to actually be able to evaluate those things from a personal perspective. And I think some interesting things can happen once that interplay comes to life. So this is kind of a presentation within a presentation. Of course, I talked about my little data in a big data world. And the process that I used last year as a very much a beginner, was to look at the tools that were already pretty accessible. So here you have a word cloud, which most people are familiar with. You go to a website, you put some text in, and it spits out these images that show you what, these images show you, we have an alarm. The images show you, they correlate with the most frequent word usage. Then as I was preparing for PyData 2015, I came across this example. Oh, actually, I can show you. I came across this example of US unemployment data from bokeh plots. So this was just a sample that I thought I might hack and display information about from my Twitter feed or Facebook or LinkedIn. Now, as I tried to create this entry-level experience for, I guess, burgeoning data scientists or citizen data scientists, I wanted to take a look at what might cause friction. And in my own experience, the information that was online for someone with limited knowledge of both software engineering and data was full of jargon. I also wanted to be aware of how much personal data was being exposed to the web, and also thought processes. I'll get to that in a little bit. And I also didn't want to just create a project where people were putting more data out there because they were just in the process of understanding, just beginning the process of understanding. I also noticed that most of the documentation describes how to pull information from APIs. So for example, Twitter had a ton of information about what was available behind the scenes, but you had to do it through APIs, which meant that your thought process was being exposed to strangers. And again, that's data that you're producing that you haven't had a chance to engage yourself and that you haven't really had a chance to process. I also thought that any precautions that you might take, so if you try to handle all of that while you should just be exploring, it might just delay you even starting a project. So another problem that I wanted to help beginners solve was how to get their data. And I decided to just work with Twitter. That's where I was able to pull down my data, and it was as simple as going to that link, clicking a download button. And I think the first time I did it, it took maybe an hour or two. And since then, I've done it maybe every 6 months or so. And it only took no more than 2 minutes to get the rest of my data. I also did LinkedIn and Google. Google took a bit longer. And let's see, LinkedIn, I think that was still within the 1 to 2 hour range. When I explored my Twitter data, I saw that, one of the reasons I chose social media data for this project is that it's just already out there and consumable by the public. I got it as a zip file. Twitter, so it was encrypted by Twitter while in transit. So as someone who might be even though with the social media information I wasn't so concerned about privacy, I did want to think about it a little bit because in the long run, I would like for people to be able to explore more data that is more personalized, such as, I don't know, Fitbit data, health information, et cetera. The file also had a I actually liked the way it was packaged. So you could actually see, it was like your Twitter homepage. You could search for keywords or words that you might be interested in and find and deliver the tweets that you actually sent that had those words. You could also look at a CSV, which could be converted using Excel, or I actually used OpenOffice. I think it's called OpenOffice Calc because it was free. And the data type in the bouquet example that I showed you earlier was also CSV, so I knew that I would be able to use the CSV file to hack the bouquet plots example. Also, each word in a tweet has its own column, and that made counting a lot easier. Or actually, that's not quite correct. You can put it, into its own column, which made counting a lot easier. And this is just a screenshot of what the folder looks like when you download it. Oh, and my first tweet. I talk a lot about cookies on Twitter, actually, or just in general. Now, for a beginner to see what I had produced on the internet in that format was actually kind of fascinating for me because I just had no idea what a tweet looked like in the background. And to know enough to actually be able to find and make that visual and mental connection between this and the experience, the user experience that I was having with Twitter or with social media in general was also pretty exciting for me. Oh, and there it is. As I mentioned before, I used OpenOffice Calc as a problem-solving tool. It was easy for me to see and understand that layout because I'd been using Excel for a few years. Oh, and dependencies. So again, this goes back to looking at friction that might cause beginners to abandon their projects and data. I started off working with Windows and Python, and I believe there was a talk earlier today about fixing Windows, which I can't wait to see the video for that myself. I actually did a talk on breaking Windows, which actually was how I was able to get past that, and basically a lot of the information that was online at the time had to do with how to use your Mac with different software. Then I learned about Anaconda, which made it pretty easy to solve that problem with dependencies. So with the experience I have now, I know what the error messages mean when I'm trying to install a piece of software and, my screen yells at me. But back then, I would see this error message, and someone would say, well, just Google the answer, which kind of worked, but it's much better if you don't have to do that. So having something like Anaconda, which resolves a lot of that was great. And even as I hacked around with this a little bit before giving the talk, I was still able to make the updates to my to the local versions of this without without having to Google much. Word cloud, I mentioned this a little bit. Of course, this is another way to get a sense of what's in your data. And my goal in this particular project was just to visualize or find an interesting way to present what I talked about most on Twitter. And I was able to do that pretty quickly with a word cloud. But of course, my other goal was to practice programming, hacking a little bit. And this is where I found that that's the tool that I used. I've mentioned Bokeh a few times. It actually solved a few problems for me. And I'll just let you read those. Overall, it just seemed to connect very closely to a process that I was already pretty familiar with, to Excel, for example. The code wasn't that complicated, and the visualization I chose, I just liked how it looked. And that, again, is the visual inspiration. Actually, though, as I was looking at this, I started thinking more about natural language processing and how you might incorporate color coding into maybe sentiment analysis, for example. I haven't gotten that far yet, but I think that's where data science could actually play more of a role in this. And now for the part that I talked about in the introduction, or that you might have read about in the introduction to this talk, data past, present, and yet to come. And I, of course, borrowed that phrasing from A Christmas Carol. So personal storage. In the past, people had some kind of filing system. Maybe it was a shoebox. Maybe you had paper files, the manila folders. You kept things in drawers. You had your own safe. And, actually, I wanted to talk a little bit more about companies. So companies would pretty much do the same thing, right? They would store your information on paper in a filing cabinet. Maybe a filing cabinet that locked, maybe there was a vault, maybe there was a door that locked somewhere in the building. And the big danger of data being lost or getting into the wrong hands in transit had to do with mail robberies. What was it, the Pony Express? The solution that I came up with for this project this is obviously just my opinion, but to remove the friction of trying to encrypt or make your data safe. Of course, the first decision was to use data that was already out there. Then to compute behind the firewall that's already on your system. So that made things easier for me. I have a hard drive that's encrypted via password. As far as storage and memory management go, a 4 gigabyte USB was plenty. 2 gigabytes would have been fine, even, and that was not just for the Twitter information, but for which my Twitter account has existed since 2008. I think I had about 4,000 tweets at the time. My Facebook account has existed since about that same amount of time. I actually put my MySpace data on the same USB, which I feel like was a bit of a coup to get. And I'm leaving one out. Oh, LinkedIn also fit on there, and I think I've had that since 2007. So to me, that feels like a lot of data, but it actually fits well onto a USB. And part of the reason, even though 4 gigabytes is not a lot of space, it is a lot of space on my computer because I like to experiment a lot, and I think that a lot of people who would be entering data science would be doing a lot of, or engineering, software programming, would be doing a lot of processing on their own machines. And it seemed safe enough. I didn't encrypt the USB drive just because from what I read, encryption does run some risk of distorting your information and corrupting files. Oh, I don't want to get to that yet. So that being said, I think my slides are a little bit out of order, so give me a second. Oh, actually, I do have a question for you all. Is anyone interested in actually downloading your personal data now? Like looking at your personal data to see what's there? Yeah, okay. So think about where you have it. So far, I've just downloaded Google, LinkedIn, and Facebook. I don't have a Fitbit, but I would be interested in see what's available there. Question?
Yeah, so I was looking at your presentation and seems like the data that you have downloaded is where you have an account, but you have a lot of personal data at sites which you don't know about. You have no account, so they
Mm-hmm.
have just mined it, collected it. Have you looked into that? How do you
I actually have.
get that data and download it or purge it?
Okay, so that's a great question. He asked about sites where you might not have an account. So he wanted to know how you would go about getting data from places where you don't necessarily have an account. Right now, I am not sure that there's definitely no central place to get that kind of information. But when I get to the part on data, what is it, personal data yet to come, I'll talk a little bit about how we might change things in order to make it easier to have even more data about ourselves that is currently just out of reach to us. So thank you for that. All right, so does anyone here has anyone here explored their own personal data before? Okay, you have? All right, what have you looked at so far?
So I have an app that tracks it's called Move, so it tracks where I am all the time. So I download the data and make maps of where I've been and histograms of what cities I've been in and what neighborhoods I've been in.
Okay, so you have an app called Move, just MOVE.
Plural, moves.
Oh, Moves, okay.
Yeah, so it distinguishes how you're moving about by running or cycling or transport. And so I also analyze that.
Okay, great. So it tracks how you move and where you go. Very interesting. Anyone else? And are you able to download it as a package, or how is the data presented to you?
There's also an API. So
Okay.
There's an API between but you can also just scrape it, whatever it needs.
Okay. Are there any limits on how much of your data you can download, or?
No.
Okay. So it's just a matter of what you have access to through the API or scraping. Okay, very interesting. So, let's see. Raise your hand again if you would be interested in looking at your okay. At your social media data? Okay, we have 10 minutes left, so what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about the answer to your question, and then I'll just show you that quick process of looking at, I think I'll do, I wasn't going to, but I think I will do Twitter data in a few minutes just to give you a sense. Well, you've kind of seen what you see. I'll do Facebook just to give you a sense of what you see, both behind the scenes and, of course, the general user interface that they provide for you. So, personal storage data future. Locking the web open, and I think that actually gets directly at the question that the gentleman asked about how to get information about how you're using the web, even if you don't have an account. There are actually, before I get to this part, there actually are some plugins that you can get from Mozilla. I don't know them off the top of my head, but I can find them after the talk if you'd like, that will show you your personal data. It'll track sites that you've visited, and it'll let you know. Also, and you can download it, but it's a lot more complicated than a project like this. You can also, I just lost my thought. Oh, you can look at your search history in a pretty straightforward way. But locking open the web. So the dream I have is for individuals to actually be more in control of their data. So instead of some outside entity determining how the information travels or how your data travels, you actually end up being in charge of how the information travels. Some companies that are working on that are using blockchain technology. You have the interplanetary system, again, using the distributed web. And I would even go as far as saying the decentralized web. I make a distinction between distributed and decentralized in that you can be a central entity and have information distributed, but that central entity, which may not be the individual, is still in control of how that data comes and goes, or they can still be in control of how that data comes and goes. Depending on the stack you're using, there are some companies and organizations and even individuals who are trying to make it so that computing happens outside of their control, and the individual doesn't have to do the computing, but the individual controls whether or not anybody has access to it. So whether or not the user controls basically whether or not an outside entity can get access to information that makes any sense. So the examples I found were storage, made safe or the safe network, the collaborative cloud, which is, I thought was interesting because that is an organization, a company, and of course the interplanetary file system. So I'm not sure if that answered your question really, deeply, but it's getting there. Okay. So, and these are just other questions that I had as I was working on this. That's pretty much the end of that part of the presentation, but I do want to walk you through that quick process of downloading your information from the web. It's actually just my personal Google account, and since you've asked about Google, I'll show you very quickly. I always found that the easiest way to get information about downloading your personal information was to Google it or, look for it through a search engine, because I could never find it on the pages, on the help pages. Any other questions while I look for that?
Did you find, were there things that you were surprised to find in like LinkedIn and Google?
I was actually surprised by how robust LinkedIn was. So most of both Facebook, MySpace, and Twitter just gave you information about, but you just got content. So things that you'd posted, some of your connections, tweets, retweets, all that. LinkedIn actually gave you some click-through information, so you could start to analyze your behavior. Sites that, people's sites that you'd visited. So connection sites that you'd visited, jobs that you'd looked at, articles that you'd clicked.
I was just going to make a suggestion. I think the point that the person earlier made was really good, like looking at data that you don't have control over.
Mm-hmm.
And there are, like, if anyone just Googles their name, then there are like these sites like Zoom Info that might have like your name or maybe some of your dependencies or people in your family with age, etc.
Right.
So like, how does that information get there, and how does one remove it? I think is for me would be Adventurous rather than the
this,
sites that I've
where it's
made a
easy.
decision to sign up for and elected to, without having read the terms of condition or anything, like I've just said, hey, take my information.
Okay.
Also, something that I've found interesting is I've read some article about people that have been arrested, and if you like search their name, then like some of the first images that come back are their mugshots. And so I know there's an issue with like people having the power to actually remove those images from the web. And so looking into like that kind of data and how people can have control over that, I think is also, area that we could look into.
Okay. Yeah, that's actually an area that I'm very interested in, and I can't go that deeply into it because honestly I'm still learning about it and we're running out of time, but definitely if you think about, I don't know how familiar you are with the blockchain and Bitcoin, but basically there are two ways that it works. So there's one way where every interaction is displayed for the world, but there's another way in which several entities have to approve the release of the private data. In this case, it's digital currency, but the only way that, well, theoretically, the only way that someone can know that that information is connected to you is if you provide a highly encrypted piece of information that several other people have to approve in order for the person on the other side to have access to it. So my pessimistic side says I think the cat's out of the bag for data that's already out there, but there is some, the optimist in me, which is a lot bigger, says that there's actually a future where we can protect our privacy in more meaningful ways. So with that, I will close out. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'd love to talk to you after if you're interested.